This game between Fabiano Caruana with white and Magnus Carlsen with black is simply stunning. It was played in round 12 of Tata Steel, and let's see what happened. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button to never miss a future video. So Magnus already shows this great fighting intent today by playing pawn to c5, the Sicilian. He doesn't go e5, go in for a Berlin or something. Remember, he's already leading the tournament, doesn't actually need to win. So we go in for this line here, the Rossolimo with bishop to b5. We saw this a couple times in their World Championship match in 2018. So one time Fabiano shattered the pawns there by taking here. Another time he played more like in this game. So Magnus goes g6, we had castles, bishop to g7, and then in one World Championship game Fabiano went rook to e1. Here he goes pawn to c3, and Magnus now goes knight to f6. Now in that rook to e1 game, Magnus went with pawn to e5, so he's playing in a different way here. He's tempting white to go e5, you can play like this. The knight comes in here, it's a different game. Instead, Fabiano goes rook to e1 here. We had castles from Magnus and pawn to d4 now. So sets up the big centre, supported by the c pawn. The most common way to play here is taking there, the standard Sicilian move, and then pushing d5. You do have to stake a claim to the centre here as black. You don't want to just get blown off the board. But Magnus instead plays d5 immediately. So a similar idea. Fabiano kicks on with pawn to e5, the knight hops in here, and we can see now that white has a bit of a space advantage, and this pawn could help with a kingside attack later. So bishop to e3 now from Fabiano. The bishop so often sits on this square when there's pressure coming against d4 from the c5 pawn. And now Magnus could play queen to b6, that's the most common here. Themes of the French defence going on in this position, of course. But instead he captures on d4 immediately. We had pawn recaptures, and now he puts the queen on b6. Now it hits the undefended bishop here, and most commonly white will take this knight on c6. Black retakes with the pawn. If you go with the queen, then a rook will come across quite quickly. That's a bit uncomfortable. And after a move like queen to c1, you hold the b2 pawn, and there's some uncomfortable pressure on this backwards c pawn, plus you have the space advantage. So white often plays like that for a small edge, but instead Fabiano goes queen to e2. Both players were looking for a fight today, it was really good to see. So now Magnus has to move, and he wants to develop this bishop, connect the rooks. If you go bishop to g4, this isn't so accurate, because pawn h3 actually kicks it back to d7, because if you take here, after recaptures, your knight doesn't actually have any squares to go to, so you're losing a piece, not the way you want to be playing. So bishop to d7 came instead, and now there's actually a threat here. So if you play knight to c3 developing, which was played a couple moves later, now black can take that knight on c3, and after pawn recaptures, you can capture this one on e5. Because if the bishop takes here, we recapture with the knight, and we've won a pawn. And if coming back here, you take that knight here, although it opens up the bishop to the queen eats on b5, and you're getting out of that issue and winning a piece at the same time. Once again, you've won a pawn. So Fabiano has to respond to that threat, coming back here. And that's why when the bishop's on b5, he drops it back into a4 here. Now Magnus brings a rook to the c file, and Fabi has to develop. Now you can't go knight b to d2, or you block the queen's defence of the b pawn. So that's why knight c3 comes. It does allow black to shatter the pawns here, give white a backwards pawn, but it's not so easy to take advantage of immediately. So black would love to go knight a5 here, but if you do that, headed for this square, opening up the rook, well then you're simply hanging a bishop, of course. So this is what Magnus now has to figure out. How do I defend that bishop and then allow my knight to move? Plus I have a weakness here, and he comes up with a beautiful solution to this. Queen d8. So he holds the bishop, he's preparing to move the knight, and he also gets the queen out of tactics here with rooks coming to the b file and things like that. So Fabi drops the bishop back into b3 now, hitting this pawn, and you don't want to go pawn to e6. Now your bishop looks horrible, typical of a kind of bad French bishop. It's very passive. Bishop to g5 is powerful, kicking the queen about. c4 is coming soon, not a good position. So instead, Magnus comes up with this move, knight to a5, an amazing idea which he probably prepared at home. So if white takes the pawn on d5, which didn't happen, then you don't win the pawn back immediately by rook takes on c3, because bishop d2 is strong, and after the rook moves, say to c2, then e6 is coming. The whole thing is just falling apart for black. But instead of taking that pawn immediately, you play bishop to f5. So now this is different. The queen is attacking the bishop, which we moved back to d8, of course. And if you move the bishop away, say to b3, now you can safely take that pawn. Different variation. And if you try and defend the bishop with pawn to c4, well, now we have this move, pawn to e6. It kicks the bishop away. Now that bishop looks trapped, but white does have bishop to g5. You hit the queen, which would jump up to d7. Now the bishop retreats. You'd have a line like this, and we chop on c4. Deep stuff, I know, but it's worth pointing out why Fabi couldn't actually take that pawn on d5. Really beautiful stuff. So running it back here, instead of taking the pawn, Fabi moved the rook across to the c-file, defending that pawn. And now Magnus had a choice here, so he could have hopped this knight into c4. Instead, he decides to take, pick up the bishop pair. So white does have the mobile pawn centre now, and black has to tread carefully. But I love how Magnus plays this. So queen to b6, he brings it back now, but he's pressuring that pawn. You don't want to go pawn to b4, or positionally this bishop's just going to have a whale of a time on these light squares here. So pawn to b4 wasn't played. We had queen a2 defending, and now pawn to a5. Magnus is looking to get that queenside counterplay going because he knows white's coming through the centre. Queen to a3 now from Fabi, hits this pawn. Rook fe8 defends, and now pawn to c4 comes, setting up the big centre here. And I like how Magnus responds, so he simply took that pawn, the pawn recaptured, and he played queen a6. He's getting off the line of this bishop, moving away from d5 with tempo, and he's also attacking this pawn. It's attacked twice now. Now you can't defend with the queen, or a4 comes, this isn't good. You could go with knight d2, it's an alternative variation, but instead we had pawn to c5, arguably the best move in the position, not a bad move at all, but it does allow Magnus to establish this monster light squared bishop on c6. Rock solid holding here, preparing a4, looking in this direction. We now had rook to b1 from Fabi, pawn to a4 from Magnus, and now rook e to c1. It's really tricky now for Fabi to find these active plans. If we notice, his heavy pieces here have all been brought to the queen side now. He's having to respond to Magnus's play, and it's more tricky for him to actually get his own kingside central plans going. Whoops, misfire. Anyway, so we now had an awesome deep move from Magnus, rook c to d8. And it might look like, well, what's going on with this move? So it brings some pressure here, yes, but there's also a very deep idea to re-maneuver this queen via a8, c8 into the kingside position rather, where it pressures the king, pressures the knight. So Fabi now plays knight to d2, not the most accurate move in the position. And what this allows Magnus to now do is, rather than take this slow route around the board, he goes queen e2. There's no rook b2 anymore, kicking the queen out of there, which could have been played with the knight on f3. Now we had pawn to f3 from Fabi. Not the best move here. He probably should have just shuffled along to the e-file to kick the queen maybe into h5. But okay, you want to keep your position moving forward psychologically. So he plays pawn f3, and now we had an awesome move from Magnus, recognizing that this is the seize of the moment. And if you want to pause and look for it, please do so. So he played rook takes on d4. Stunning move. Now Fabi recaptured that rook. Just to show you one variation, if he tried rook e1 to kick the queen out of there and then take the rook, well, queen d3 is strong because you're hitting this undefended queen, and if you chop here, you recapture and you've got your rook away from the problem. You've won a pawn. So rook e1 didn't come. We had the bishop takes the rook, queen takes on d2 now. This is the point, you win back that piece, plus you've won a pawn. And this bishop's now a big pawn, just staring at its own pawns, bad bishop, and this one on c6 is just a monster. So rook to d1 came, queen to f4, and now Magnus was critical of this move after the game. He thought that queen b2 was perhaps better, with the idea of coming to e2 later in the game, possibly dropping the bishop back to c3 at some point. Fabi goes queen b4, but Magnus was critical because he talked about the fact that the queen trade favoured him. So he now pushes e6, the bishop dropped back, and we had these queens coming off the board here. Now Fabi recaptures with the bishop, which gives this pawn. If he retook with the rook, which he could do, then bishop f8 is the problem. So you hit this one now. Say you defend with bishop d4, well rook d8 is strong. And without going through all the variations, you got an undefended rook here, an exposed king to checks, a passed a-pawn. There's too many tactical issues basically to hold on to everything. Black will soon be crashing through. So that's why he took with the bishop instead. He gave the e-pawn, but bishop a3 now came from Fabi, so this is his idea to blockade that passed a-pawn. And now Magnus does what he does so well, he just starts improving the position. Bishop to f6, and after king f2, bishop e7. So he bounces it round to pressure this pawn, and also x-ray the bishop. Possibly you'll have some b6 or b5 stuff coming, taking advantage of the pin of that pawn to the bishop behind. So rook b6 sits on that. Also threatens to give back the exchange in some lines. So rook c8 was played. Now if you were to chop back the exchange, we can take here, and rook d7 isn't coming with the same threats because you can simply take here, you're supported by the rook. So coming back here, Fabi didn't give up the exchange, he played rook to d2 instead, and it's difficult for him to improve his position, but there's lots that Magnus can do. So pawn to f6, pawn to f4, pawn to e5 now. We had pawn takes here, recaptures, rook e2 attacks, but now Magnus switches to the king, which is exposed. This is the double problem that white has. King to e1 here, and rook to f5 holds that pawn. Now the rook came back to b1 here. Fabi's rook's just passively sitting there on b6. If you're not actually going to take here, then it's not in the game, so he brings it back. We had pawn to e4, so it holds that pawn in a different way, frees up this rook for action now. Rook to c1, bishop to h4 check. And now you can't really start hopping the king around in any of these directions, or the rook's coming in, the bishop's coming in, big problems. So pawn to g3 comes, but we note that it now weakens the f3 square. And Magnus is just probing now, beautiful stuff. So bishop to g5 was played, we had rook to b1 here, rook to f3, hits this undefended bishop laterally. The bishop came back to c1, and of course we don't exchange off here. So the bishop retreats back. We want to keep that monster bishop pair tying up those white rooks. The rook came to b6, now threatening to give back the exchange and take the e-pawn here. So Magnus goes rook to f5 now, so that if this line occurs, takes, rook takes here, he picks up this one on c5. And black is simply 2 pawns up in this position. You don't even have time to take this one, or you lose the bishop here. So we didn't have this line. After rook f5, Fabi instead played the bishop out to a3 here. We had king to f7, rook to f2, rook to f3 here. And now again, it's really tricky to suggest moves for Fabi. So the bishop's attacked here. If he drops it back to b2, well, we can go bishop e7, keeping the bishop pair. And once again, black's just going to slowly improve the position. So instead, Fabi took here, the pawn recaptured, the king came to f1, but after bishop d4, Fabi was fed up. The game's completely lost. This pawn will go through, or this one, too much to cope with. He threw in the towel, and Magnus wins Tata Steel Masters 2022. So huge congratulations to him, a stunning performance. If you enjoyed this game, then do consider subscribing to the channel, and see more amazing Tata Steel games, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.